The winter meetings are finally here, so that means it's going to be one of the busiest weeks of the offseason. We'll talk about it next on Locked On Royals.
You are Locked On Royals, your daily Kansas City Royals podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
You are tuned into another edition of Locked On Royals on the Locked On Podcast Network. I'm your host, Jack Johnson, and you can find me on Twitter or X at JohnnyJ_15. That's at JOHNYJ_15. And you can also find us on wherever you get your podcast. That can be Spotify, Apple Podcast, Amazon Music, Google Podcast. We're on Odyssey and YouTube. Just be sure to hit that follow button and subscribe. If you're a first-time listener and you want to know a little bit more about me and this show, I am based here in Kansas City. I work at Sports Radio 810 WHB, doing some hosting, co-hosting, and a little bit of producing as well. But when it comes to this podcast, when you click on this link, you know that you're going to be getting 30 straight minutes of Royals baseball. Today's show is brought to you by FanDuel. You can start the season with a big return on FanDuel, where new customers can place a $5 bet, and you'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win that first $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com to get started today. Well, as we teased in the opening seconds of this episode, the winter meetings are finally here. We've already gotten more than an appetizer to the winter meetings with Juan Soto signing last night with the New York Mets. We'll talk about that in the second segment. And I think it's only the beginning, right? We got word, we got some noise that Juan Soto was going to come to a decision late last night, and that it was basically going to trigger the rest of all the big signings to happen. And we got all week to cover that. Should be a lot of fun. Hopefully, the Royals are one of those teams that are very active at this point in time. I anticipate them to be. Maybe not 4 or 5 moves, but it wouldn't surprise me to see 1 or 2 throughout this week, because that's usually when a lot of GMs are the most active. That's when a lot of teams are most willing to make trades. And I think going into this week, the Royals will be able to really progress on some conversations that they may have already had. And I think going back to the Jonathan India trade, there were guys' names that popped up that made some sense for the Royals, right? We saw that Taylor Ward's name had popped up. We had seen that Alec Boehm's name had popped up. It's not to say that those deals can't progress, because they certainly can, but we know that Alec Boehm's asking price is pretty high, and we also have the impression that the Angels are going to try to improve this team, and trading away their leadoff hitter and one of their best players in Taylor Ward doesn't really fit that narrative. So the Royals will have to pivot to maybe a different selection of guys, and I'm sure they already have going into this week. One name that continues to pop up, over and over again is Brett Baty of the New York Mets. And maybe now, after the deal with Juan Soto, it really starts to put the ball in motion. I'm not saying that a deal could be done this week, but I will say that name is now absolutely more on my radar. I think that name is starting to heat up a little bit more. I think the deal with Juan Soto really starts to progress that a little bit. And I think that Brett Baty maybe wasn't the best option when I first had gone over the list of candidates. And I do want to be very clear. I don't want to come out here and say that would be a fantastic trade or a terrible trade if it happened, because what we don't know as fans, consumers of the sport, is that just because you go after that guy doesn't mean you were never interested in the Taylor Ward, Alec Boehm idea, or JJ Bleday or Adolis Garcia. A lot of times it comes down to what that asking price is, right? That's what happens with trades. Whenever a new name emerges or a player who's not as good emerges, it's not that they picked that guy over the better player. It's that player probably fell more in their price range. And I think when it comes to Brett Baty, who, of course, would be the starting third baseman for the Mets this year, that I think you can feel good about, that the Mets, for the first time, really, I think in his big league career, we're going to give him the go-ahead. That's a Mets team now that's maybe the second leading favorite to win the World Series on the National League side, right behind the Dodgers. And maybe now they could jump them with having Juan Soto in that lineup and Francisco Lindor. If they can sign back Pete Alonso, maybe that looks a little bit far-fetched now because of the money they just put into Juan Soto, and none of that is deferred. But the Mets could also be looking to improve a couple other spots out there. And where the Mets are at right now, a team that is expected to win anywhere from 95 to 100 games, they might want to upgrade at third base. And that would mean unloading Brett Baty to a team like the Royals. Brett Baty's numbers, when you do go look at them after watching this podcast, or maybe you're scrolling through it right now, they're not good, right? I don't think anything about Brett Baty's big league career has been good. I don't even think some of the advanced numbers from last year were very good. But I do think there is something to be intrigued about when it comes to a former big-time prospect. Brett Baty was a huge prospect in baseball. He's got a good frame, about 6'3", 215, 220. He plays third base, so maybe that would be their upgrade, middle-of-the-order bat that they could be talking about. But it's a 25-year-old and a guy that just turned 25 and isn't a free agent until 2029. So you're not just making the move for this year. You're banking on maybe Brett Baty being your third baseman of the future. And from what we've seen at the minor league level and what his ceiling could be, Brett Baty's more of a traditional third baseman than Maikel Garcia is. I don't think it would be a flip or a swap of Brett Baty for Maikel Garcia. I think other pieces would be involved, and I think the Royals would hopefully want to hang on to Maikel Garcia, considering they wanted to make a full recovery from those bone spurs in his right elbow. And maybe the Mets will be looking at that too and saying, well, we don't want to trade for a guy that just had surgery, even though he'll be ready by spring training. You know, we would maybe rather add to our bullpen. We might want to add to our rotation, or maybe they do want to add a prospect or two for a guy like Brett Baty, though he's barely removed from being a prospect despite debuting 3 years ago. So if that's the idea, right, if that's the move, I think I could come around to it, because it may just mean that the names that I have brought up, the names that you all have brought up, are out of the price range, right? Because we said this last week. Trading away Brady Singer made things more difficult for the Royals when trying to trade for another bat. And it appears that's what they would prefer to do, was go after somebody that certainly is being, put out there. There's trade rumors about him. They would want to go and approach those teams about those players, but those teams aren't just going to give up those guys for nothing, right? I love the idea of J.J. Bleday. The Oakland A's also love J.J. Bleday. They just signed a starter in Luis Severino. They got Lawrence Butler out there as well. They got Brent Rooker. They've got great pieces to build around. And I think they are trying to build to the future for when they get to Vegas, they'll have a competent and competitive ball club. Not that J.J. Bleday will be a part of that, but maybe they're just not too high on the idea of moving him with him only being 27 years old. I like the idea of a Taylor Ward. We've already said why the Angels might not trade him. And even somebody like Adolis Garcia, maybe the Rangers will want to cut back on some payroll, but Adolis Garcia is also only 1 year removed, or I guess 2 years now, from an incredible season and being a postseason hero. And the Rangers certainly value that. And even last year when he struggled, they may be viewing that as the one-off, the outlier. And if they're going to trade away Adolis Garcia, it's going to take a lot in return. So if Brett Baty's the one they circle, I do like the upside. And I think that even with the numbers he's posted at the big league level, there is a chance that he becomes that impact bat, because what the Mets were never really able to do, with the exception of 2023, was make him the everyday guy, right? Whether it be not staying healthy or not performing well enough, the Mets were certainly at a different point in their competitive window than the Royals are right now. But Brett Baty could be a guy that you say, hey, he's 25 years old, a former top 100 prospect. We like the frame. We like what he could become. We like the profile. He's never been an everyday player. And sometimes that's seen as a negative, right? We viewed that with MJ Melendez and Kyle Isbell and Michael Massey and Maikel Garcia. Hey, they've never been a big league ball player or an everyday big league ball player. So you're going to have to go through those growing pains. I could see the other way around, where Brett Baty is maybe a guy that needs the everyday at-bats more so than some of the guys who have struggled with it, right? If you're looking at third base and you say Maikel Garcia or Brett Beatty, well, Brett Beatty was a former big-time prospect and was slated to be the starting third baseman on a team that was going to win 95 to 100 games. It's not going to say that he's going to be a superstar or he would have been fantastic for the Mets. Again, this trade hasn't even happened. I'm just going to put him in the circle of names that I think could be a possibility that the Royals could strike on as early this week. But that upside at third base might be better than the upside that Maikel Garcia could give you. And then Maikel Garcia becomes your super utility guy. But going into the winter meetings, I guess it wouldn't surprise me now if Brett Beatty is the guy the Royals acquire. I do think that there is interest there. I think there is a fit. I would be fascinated to know what the Mets would be asking for somebody like Brett Beatty, because considering he's been in the big leagues for 3 years, has never really put it together. The numbers aren't there, even though he's incredibly young. The signing of Juan Soto last night indicates, the Mets are all in, right? And they're not going to want to gamble on a lot of guys at certain positions, certainly not spots like third base. And if Brett Beatty's a guy that they're willing to gamble on, then maybe the asking price will be much higher. But for the Royals reaching out to some teams, maybe that name right now is the one to watch. And we've got all week to cover that. Hopefully we'll be covering a big trade or a signing from this ball club, but only time will tell. As of right now, it's just Monday in the morning. So a long week to go here for the winter meetings. Okay, we're going to take our first break of the show. When we come back, the big news of baseball last night, and more importantly, the big news in all of sports last night, was Juan Soto signing the richest deal in sports history, going to the New York Mets for 15 years. He turned down a 16-year deal with the New York Yankees. We'll go over all of that and give our thoughts next on Locked On Royals. You are tuned into Locked On Royals on the Locked On Podcast Network. I'm your host, Jack Johnson, and you can find me on Twitter or X at JohnnyJ_15. Want to give a shout out to our first sponsor today in Omaha Steaks. Nothing delivers comfort and joy quite like the unrivaled quality and taste of Omaha Steaks. This year, skip the holiday hustle and bustle and save 50% off site-wide during their cyber sale at omahasteaks.com. Plus, get a $30 reward card when you shop early and score an extra $30 off a promo code MLB. With 5 generations of experience, Omaha Steaks consistently delivers the world's best steak experience, and their gifting experts have made it easy to deliver the perfect gift with thoughtfully curated gift packages starting at $89.99. From legendary steaks to mouth-watering desserts and more, save 50% off site-wide during the cyber sale at omahasteaks.com. Plus, our listeners get an extra $30 off with promo code MLB and a $30 reward card when you shop early. That's 50% off omahasteaks.com and an extra $30 off with promo code MLB. Minimum purchase may apply. Well, last night as I'm watching the Chiefs and Chargers Sunday night game, we get the breaking news that Juan Soto has found a new home, and a home for the next 15 years. If he decides to play out the entire contract, I guess we'll see on that. But what a deal that the New York Mets and Steve Cohen were able to put in place for the big name, the big fish in free agency, a 15-year, $765 million deal. No deferred money here. So what you saw with Ohtani last year, that's not happening with Juan Soto. And it has escalators, per Jeff Passan, that can reach above $800 million. It is the largest deal in professional sports history. We knew it was going to be a big price. I think I said at one point in time, like well north of $600 million, but I didn't think it would be $165 million more on that deal for Juan Soto. The New York Yankees, to me, felt like the team that was just never going to let him walk away, and certainly not walk away to a team like the Mets. But if you're a Yankees fan this morning, you got to feel just sick to your stomach, because what the Yankees had last year, I think, was a group that if they retained Soto, I mean, that's the perennial favorite for the next 4 to 5 years in the American League. And I think if you were a Royals fan seeing that news break last night, it's not that you'll never have to worry about Juan Soto again, because, hey, who knows? if the Royals get to the World Series in the coming years, it might be a rematch of 2015, and they're going to face a damn good New York Mets team. But not having to worry about Juan Soto in the American League in a deal like this, I think that had you jumping for joy a little bit. Because last year, and I hate saying last year because we're only a few months removed from this past season, but losing to the Yankees, I think, was a combination of a lot. They didn't have the lineup to keep up with the Yankees, but taking Juan Soto out of that lineup going into 2025, it makes you feel a lot better about the teams they would be matched up against if they are lucky enough to get back to the postseason. Because Juan Soto was an MVP candidate that was behind the real MVP candidate of 2024 and Aaron Judge, or I guess he hit right ahead of him. To go through that lineup and deal with two MVP candidates, at times it just became insurmountable. And I think when the American League teams went up against Stanton and Judge and Soto, and even guys like, Gleyber Torres and Austin Wells are contributing, and Jazz Chisholm, like, it was something about that 1-2 punch that it always felt like it was too big of a mountain to climb in beating the Yankees, because that lineup was unbeatable. That lineup was one that truly was the closest thing to what the Dodgers had on the National League side. I mean, the Dodgers had 3 MVP guys in that first 4 spots in the batting order, and Shohei Ohtani, Freddie Freeman, and Mookie Betts. But the Yankees, I mean, they had the Titan-like lineup on the American League side. And when he was posted in free agency, or he, became a free agent officially, I thought to myself, well, I hope he doesn't go to the Dodgers, because now we're just forming a mega team, a super team. But if he's to go somewhere else, I hope it is something like the New York Mets, because they're on the National League side. They're in a brutal division that is loaded with talent. And the Royals, if they are to make it to the postseason side and you're worrying about who to play, you're not going to have to worry anymore about a lineup that has both Aaron Judge and Juan Soto. And for the Yankees, it's not that they're just going to sit back and just relax now the rest of the offseason. They're certainly not going to. In fact, this is a major gut punch to the Yankees organization. Not just that he walked away, but he just walked down the street and is going to be playing in Flushing for the New York Mets. And that's got to be a tough pill to swallow for sure. I know that during the ALDS, we had some Yankees fans commenting, and some nicer than others. But those fans out there today, I mean, it's got to be a terrible Monday. The fact this happened on a Sunday night and then you got to go to work or go to school the next day, that sucks. I truly do mean that. I'm not trying to poke fun or anything. I mean, to lose a superstar player, even though you had him for just 1 year, I mean, the fact it's the New York Mets that were able to outbid you. I mean, how many times in your baseball fandom, whether you're a Yankees fan or not, have you seen the New York Mets outbid the New York Yankees for a star player? I mean, it was reported that the Yankees offered him a 16-year deal worth $760 million, and the Mets and Steve Cohen just went above and beyond with that. 15 years, $765 million. I understand that there are going to be people out there too that say, this is an overpay, right? I mean, $765 million is not just pocket change, right? Even when it comes to an owner and the billions of dollars they have, like, this is the largest deal in professional sports history with no deferred money. We're talking $51 million a year. And Juan Soto is a megastar. I think the funny part about this is when you hear 15 years, you're thinking like, oh, he's not going to be playing in his age 43, 44 season. Juan Soto is still incredibly young. Like, the fact he debuted at 19, he's been in the league now for a while. 15 years, I believe, puts him at 41. Like, if he played all the way through that contract, which who knows, 10 years down the road, what Juan Soto looks like. But he is such a consistent player. I will say this, that him having the more expensive deal over Shohei Ohtani, I think will always be a surprise to me. But that's the way baseball has been working. Like, everybody got one-upped. Manny Machado in that huge deal with the Padres got one-upped by Bryce Harper and his deal with the Phillies. And then that deal got one-upped by Shohei Ohtani. And this deal was able to one-up Ohtani's and what the New York Mets were able to do. I mean, that's just baseball. It feels like every single offseason, there is a player like this that hits free agency and they're going to be making north of $700 million. I mean, you go back 30 years. If you were to tell somebody, a fan in the late 90s, that 30 years from now, a player is going to make $765 million over 15 years, they would have called you crazy. But that's the way baseball has been trending. And not having a salary cap certainly impacts it, right? But I do think for baseball, we discussed how Luis Severino was good for baseball and going to the A's this year, signing that deal, the richest deal in their club's history. I do think Juan Soto signing with the Mets might have been the best option of who was going after him. I know that Toronto had made a push. I think Toronto would have been a good fit as well. But to even out the playing field a little bit, I mean, this now, I think, puts the Mets out of the running to keep Pete Alonso. I mean, we're talking a lot of money here. I'm not sure that the Mets could retain somebody like Pete Alonso. So now you have other great players that are going to sign elsewhere. And maybe a guy like Pete Alonso goes to Toronto and they'd have to find a spot for him because of Vladdy Jr. But you know what I mean, is teams out there are going to be able to capitalize on teams like the Mets who put all their eggs into one basket with a guy like Juan Soto. But now it also means the team like the Yankees is going to be aggressive on some of those other guys that maybe they weren't really interested in before Juan Soto was off the books. And now that he is, what a matchup it's going to be in May when I think Juan Soto and the Mets return to Yankee Stadium. I'd imagine that reception is not going to be very warm. I think that'll be a very venomous crowd toward Juan Soto. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe you would be giving him a standing ovation. But I think seeing how Yankee Stadium can react to players that leave, this would be one of those moments where Juan Soto would really not be perceived well from the home faithful at Yankee Stadium. But that's still months down the road. That was the big news of last night and will be the biggest story of free agency this offseason in Major League Baseball. Juan Soto going to the Mets on a 15-year, $765 million deal. It is the largest deal in professional sports history. All right, we're going to take our final break of the show. When we come back, if it comes down to the fifth spot and it's an in-house candidate, would the Royals rather go with Kyle Wright or Alec Marsh? We'll talk about that next on Locked On Royals. You are tuning to Locked On Royals and the Locked On Podcast Network. I'm your host, Jack Johnson, and you can find me on Twitter or X at JohnnyJ_15. Want to give a shout out to our title sponsor today in FanDuel, and you can get ready to tackle the NFL action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because right now new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL all in one place. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. You'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win that first $5 bet. That's FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch and make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. And for my pick, I'll go to Monday Night Football, take the over on passing yards for Joe Burrow against that Dallas Cowboys defense. He's been excellent this year. Expect him to be good tonight. Last thing we're going to wrap up this Monday episode with is a little bit about the Royals rotation and how it may look. And I wanted to touch on this because yesterday I was able to answer all the questions that were sent in from listeners. We didn't have a typical Mailbag Friday, so I had people just send in questions on Twitter. Hopefully my YouTube questions were able to upload. I believe they were last time I had checked, or answers to those questions. But I had a couple of those questions come in on the rotation of, do you feel like it would be Alec Marsh or Kyle Wright if both guys pitch well in spring training? I had some people say Kyle Wright is their pick. In fact, the majority of those folks did say Kyle Wright would be their pick over Alec Marsh. I understand why, because Kyle Wright was one time a 20-game winner. He was a great, middle of the rotation guy for the Atlanta Braves, a damn good Atlanta Braves team that won the World Series. But I do think that, reality is something that does need to be addressed, even on times where we're hopeful. Like, you can be really high on a guy. I've been high on Maikel Garcia before, MJ Melendez. I've been high on Daniel Lynch before. But sometimes a ceiling is just a ceiling. When we talk about potential, and eventually that tale gets old, right? That argument gets a little bit stale. Adalberto Mondesi maybe being the guy of the late 2010s and early 2020s of just always feeling good about his potential. Hey, if he's healthy, I want him to be the shortstop. Or when Bobby Witt Jr. gets to Kansas City, let's keep Mondesi at short and move Bobby Witt Jr. over to third, which was actually the Royals' plan when it first happened. But ceiling and potential and what a guy once was is not always going to be what they are years down the road, right? So when it comes to Kyle Wright, I am hopeful that he can stay healthy in spring training, and more importantly, the stuff looks good. But the reality of this situation is that Kyle Wright hasn't pitched in basically 2 years because he got hurt a handful of times. Let's phrase that differently. Pitched fully in 2 years, where he got a full year under his belt. Really, since his great year in 2022, he just hasn't stayed healthy. And that is a number one concern when bringing him back, right? This shoulder reconstruction, that's going to affect you in some ways. And you hope, you've got your fingers crossed that he comes back 100% and he looks better than he really ever has before. But the reality of this situation is it's hard to look great after 2 years of not pitching. You've got those stories, right? You've got those moments where somebody returns after 3 or 4 years of not staying healthy and they're the best version of themselves. But for Kyle Wright, I guess my expectation is let's see if he can crack it in the bullpen. But I will say what does give me hope that the Royals are super high on him and high on him bouncing back is that every time we're talking about the rotation, we've seen Kyle Wright's name thrown in there. We view him as a starter. I believe J.J. Piccolo said they view him as a starter. So if they're viewing him as a starter, that means they feel very strongly that not only will he bounce back from the surgery and the injuries, but that he can be somebody you're counting on to throw multiple innings. And I'm not talking 3 or 4. I mean, you're wanting to get to the point where he can go 5, 6, or 7. And when I look at somebody like Alec Marsh, I still think he's the front runner because last year he was in the rotation. I thought he had a really strong finish in September after being recalled from Omaha. They still really love Alec Marsh. And if both were to pitch well in spring training, I think the nod goes to Alec Marsh. It's not to say that Kyle Wright will never start a game because I do believe he does if he stays healthy. I think he'll get a spot start or there'll be a doubleheader game where he does need to start. That's just inevitable, really, in a 162-game season. But I do think with a guy coming off a shoulder surgery, having work done up there, it's different than Tommy John. You're going to lose some velocity. You might lose some spin, some zip on your best pitches. And Kyle Wright's going to have to deal with that. Kyle Wright may need to become a different version of himself. But when I look at that number 5 spot, the reason I said Alec Marsh is my pick, I think right now the starting rotation, until proven otherwise, is going to be Cole Reagans, Seth Lugo, Michael Wacha, Chris Bubich, Alec Marsh. They could bring in a swing starter, which I do believe they will a little bit later on in the offseason. Michael Lorenzen makes sense for that. There's a couple other cheap one-year deal guys they could look into, but you're not talking about the number 5 guy. I think the number 5 spot may come down to Alec Marsh, Daniel Lynch, or Kyle Wright. And I do think Alec Marsh would have the top spot at this point in time. But it's not to say Kyle Wright can't provide value if he's not starting. I think he could provide value in the bullpen if he stays healthy and he can somewhat channel what he was in 2022. But first things first, Kyle Wright does have to stay healthy this offseason and all of spring training. Well, that's going to do it for another edition of Locked On Royals on the Locked On Podcast Network. I've been your host, Jack Johnson. Thank you for making Locked On Royals your first listen today. For your second, find Locked On MLB as baseball guru Sully brings a daily blend of humor and baseball. keeping you updated on every rumor and story throughout the offseason. Find Locked On MLB on YouTube or wherever you listen to your podcast. Tomorrow, we're going to have a very special interview with a Royals draft pick from last year. That will be our big tease for it. We teased it last week. We're excited about it. Should be a lot of fun, and that will be our episode. Unless we do have breaking news and there's a trade, we would have that interview and then maybe a shortened 15-minute episode like we did when the Jonathan India news broke. But until tomorrow, you take it easy, Kansas City.